In July 1945, 2 months after Hitler's death, a German U-boat surfaced off Argentina and surrendered. The crew had been at sea for months. Their story didn't add up. Then another U-boat appeared. Same thing. Where had they been? What were they hiding? Some say they'd been to Antarctica, to a secret Nazi base that might still exist today. But is any of it true? Few conspiracy theories capture the imagination quite like the legend of a secret Nazi base hidden deep in the frozen wasteland of Antarctica. Type Nazi Antarctica into any search engine, and you'll find thousands of websites, YouTube videos, and forum posts claiming this isn't just a theory, it's documented fact. Some go even further, weaving tales of UFO technology, underground cities carved into ice, and even suggesting that Hitler himself escaped to this frozen fortress at the end of World War II. But how much of this is actually true? And where does documented history end and wild speculation begin? Today we're going to separate fact from fiction, examining the real German Antarctic expedition, the suspicious U-boat surrenders after the war, and how a kernel of historical truth became wrapped in layers of increasingly bizarre mythology. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what happened in Antarctica during the Nazi era, and what definitely didn't. So grab a warm drink, settle in, and let's journey to the bottom of the world to uncover the truth about the alleged secret Nazi base in Antarctica. Let's start with what we know for certain. Did the Nazis visit Antarctica? The answer is an unequivocal yes. This part isn't speculation or conspiracy theory, it's well-documented historical fact. But before you get too excited about secret bases and flying saucers, I should warn you, the reality is considerably more mundane than the legends suggest. Between December 1938 and April 1939, a German research vessel called the Schwabenland carried a Nazi expedition to the Antarctic coast. Their destination was an area already claimed by Norway, known as Queen Maud Land, a vast territory along the Antarctic coastline, roughly the size of Western Europe. The expedition was commanded by Captain Alfred Richer, a professional naval officer and experienced polar explorer. Richer wasn't some shadowy SS officer on a secret mission. He was a legitimate scientist and navigator who had previously participated in Count Zeppelin's polar flight in 1910. His team included geographers, meteorologists, oceanographers, and other scientific specialists. So what were they actually doing there? The answer is both simpler and more practical than conspiracy theorists would have you believe. Whale oil. Now, I know that doesn't sound as exciting as secret bases or alien technology, but bear with me because this is crucial to understanding the real story. In the 1930s, whale oil was an essential commodity for European nations. It was used primarily in margarine production, something that's hard to imagine today, but was a dietary staple for millions of people. Whale oil was also used in soap, cosmetics, lamp fuel, and various industrial applications. Germany, like many European nations, needed massive quantities of this resource. But there was a problem. Overhunting in traditional whaling areas meant that the great whale populations had been decimated. The whalers had been forced to move into the dangerous waters of the Antarctic, where whales were still plentiful, but the conditions were extraordinarily harsh. By the 1938-39 season, Germany was operating 50 whale catcher vessels and 7 factory ships off the coast of Queen Maud Land. This was a huge operation, representing a significant investment and employing thousands of German sailors and workers. But Germany faced a strategic problem. They were operating in waters claimed by Norway, and they were dependent on Norwegian-controlled harbors and facilities for support. The German government wanted to change this situation. Their goal was to claim a portion of Antarctica for the Third Reich and potentially establish a base, not for UFOs or secret weapons, but for their whaling fleet. A German-controlled coastal facility would allow them to operate more independently and secure this vital resource for the German economy. So the Schwabenland expedition set sail with 3 main objectives: to map and photograph the Antarctic coast, to conduct scientific research, and to make a territorial claim for Germany. And they accomplished all three goals. The expedition was remarkably successful from a scientific standpoint. Using two Dornier Do-18 flying boats, these were specially designed float planes that could be launched from the ship by catapult, the Germans flew numerous reconnaissance missions over the interior of Queen Maud Land. These flights were groundbreaking. They photographed over 350,000 square kilometers of previously unmapped territory, discovering mountain ranges, glaciers, and coastal features that had never been documented before. The Germans named many of these features after themselves and after prominent Nazis, names that, in many cases, were later changed by Norwegian authorities after the war. And yes, the territorial claim part is true too. During their overflights, the Germans dropped metal stakes adorned with swastikas onto the ice below, ceremonially claiming the land for the Third Reich. They called their claimed territory Neuschwabenland, New Swabia, after the ship and the German region of Swabia. But here's what's important to understand. Dropping flags or markers onto ice is very different from actually establishing a base. The Germans never set up a permanent facility in Antarctica. They never landed personnel on the mainland with the intention of staying. They took photographs, they made maps, they conducted oceanographic and meteorological research from their ship, and then they went home. The expedition returned to Germany mainly in April 1939, just 5 months before the outbreak of World War II. Plans were made for a follow-up expedition in 1940 to potentially establish that coastal whaling station they wanted. But by then, Europe was at war, and those plans were abandoned. The Schwabenland itself was converted for military use and was eventually sunk by Allied bombers in 1944. But the expedition did make one genuinely remarkable discovery, something that would later fuel speculation about a secret base. During their aerial surveys, the Germans discovered an area of Queen Maud Land where the ground was ice-free, despite being surrounded by thousands of square kilometers of glacial ice. This warm, ice-free region was named the Schirmacher Oasis. Now, this wasn't warm in any comfortable sense. Temperatures there still regularly drop below freezing, but it was warm enough that exposed rock and small lakes existed. The Germans theorized that this might be due to volcanic activity beneath the ice, warming the ground from below. This discovery is real. The Schirmacher Oasis exists. And here's something interesting. It's now home to two modern research stations, one Russian and one Indian. Scientists work there year-round because it's one of the few accessible areas in this part of Antarctica. But conspiracy theorists have seized upon this discovery, claiming that this warm oasis would have been the perfect location for a secret Nazi base. They suggest that the Germans could have built an underground facility here, heated by geothermal energy, hidden from aerial observation. It's a compelling idea, but there's no evidence whatsoever that the Germans ever returned to this location after 1939, let alone built a secret base there. Still, this is where facts end and speculation begins, a pattern we'll see repeated throughout this story. So what happened in Antarctica during World War II itself? While the Germans never returned, the region did see some military activity, though nothing like the secret submarine bases of legend. When war broke out in September 1939, the British government became concerned about German naval operations in the Southern Ocean. And they had good reason to worry. Britain controlled significant Antarctic territory, including a large claimed sector, as well as strategically important islands like South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands, and the Falkland Islands. More importantly, Britain and allied nations like Norway still had whaling operations in these waters. Whale oil was just as important for the Allied war effort as it had been for peacetime Germany. Those factory ships and whale catchers represented both valuable resources and potential targets. The British fears proved justified. In February 1941, a German auxiliary cruiser called the Penguin, Not a regular warship, but a converted merchant vessel armed with hidden guns patrolled the Ross Sea off the Antarctic coast. Her mission was to find and destroy Allied whaling ships, and she was successful. The Penguin seized 3 Norwegian whale factory ships, capturing over 20,000 tons of precious whale oil, an enormous haul that represented a significant loss for the Allies and a propaganda victory for Germany. The Penguin's captain even used the captured Norwegian ships to disguise his own vessel, allowing him to get close to unsuspecting Allied vessels. The Penguin's raid sent shockwaves through Allied command. If Germany was willing to operate this far south, what else might they be planning? Could the Germans, or their Japanese allies, be planning to establish submarine bases on Antarctic islands or even on the mainland itself? These concerns led to Operation Tabarin in 1943. This was a secret British military operation with multiple objectives. The primary goal was to establish a British military presence in Antarctica to watch for enemy vessels and potentially deny the Germans any bases in the region. A secondary objective was political, to strengthen British territorial claims and deter Argentina from pushing its own claims to the Falklands and other Antarctic territories. The British established several small bases in the Antarctic Peninsula region and on nearby islands. These weren't large facilities, just small teams of military personnel and scientists living in primitive conditions, watching the seas and conducting research when possible. And here's something fascinating. These bases were successful, not at finding German submarines, which never actually came, but at conducting scientific research. The operation was so productive that it was never fully shut down. Instead, it was transitioned to civilian control after the war and eventually became the British Antarctic Survey, which is still operating today as one of the world's leading polar research organizations. So the irony is that while British fears of German Antarctic bases proved unfounded, those fears led to the creation of a permanent British presence in Antarctica that outlasted the war and continues to this day. But what about those German submarines? If the Kriegsmarine didn't establish bases in Antarctica during the war, what about after the war ended? This is where our story takes a turn into more mysterious territory and where the seeds of the conspiracy theory were first planted. On July 10, 1945, more than 2 months after Germany's surrender, a German submarine surfaced off the coast of Argentina and surrendered to authorities in Mar del Plata. This was U-530, commanded by Otto Wehrmuth. Then, on August 17, 1945, another German submarine, U-977, commanded by Heinz Schaefer, also surfaced and surrendered in Argentina. Both events were highly unusual. The war in Europe had ended on May 8, 1945. Most German U-boats had been ordered to surface, fly black flags of surrender, and proceed to designated Allied ports. Hundreds of U-boats complied with these orders. So why had these 2 submarines waited months to surrender? Where had they been, and what had they been doing? The crews of both submarines were extensively interrogated by Argentine authorities and later by British and American intelligence officers. Their stories were suspicious, to say the least. Both claimed to have been at sea when Germany surrendered, and both said they had decided to sail to Argentina rather than surrender to the British or Americans. Why Argentina? Both commanders claimed they feared execution or harsh treatment as prisoners of war and hoped for better treatment in Argentina, which had a large German immigrant population and had remained neutral for most of the war. Argentina, in fact, didn't declare war on Germany until March 27, 1945. Less than 6 weeks before the war ended, and this was largely a symbolic gesture to gain admission to the United Nations. But there were problems with both stories. The timelines didn't quite add up. The distances traveled seemed to require more fuel than the submarines should have had. Some crew members gave contradictory accounts of their journey. And most suspiciously, both submarines appeared to have been cleaned and emptied of most personal belongings before surrender, as if evidence had been deliberately removed. Intelligence analysts at the time concluded that both submarines had likely made stops somewhere before arriving in Argentina. The most obvious explanation was that they had landed personnel, documents, or valuables somewhere along the South American coast. Argentina had a significant pro-Nazi German population, and it's well documented that some Nazi officials did escape to South America after the war. This is the historical reality. These U-boat voyages were suspicious, and they probably did involve some kind of evacuation mission. But this is also where historical fact ends and speculation begins. In July and August of 1945, the Argentine press ran wild with these stories. Remember, these submarines had arrived months after the war ended. Their crews were evasive about their activities, and Argentina was full of German immigrants, some of whom were openly sympathetic to the Nazi cause. Local newspapers began printing increasingly sensational stories. Some suggested the U-boats had brought Nazi war criminals to Argentina. Others claimed they had transported Nazi gold. And then the stories got really wild. Some articles suggested that high-ranking Nazis, or even Hitler himself, had been smuggled to Argentina, or perhaps first to Antarctica and then to Argentina. Now we should pause here and address the Hitler question. Could Hitler have been on one of these submarines? The answer is almost certainly no. The evidence for Hitler's death in his Berlin bunker in April 1945 is overwhelming. Multiple witnesses saw his body. Dental records were matched. Even Soviet intelligence, which initially kept quiet about Hitler's death for propaganda purposes, eventually confirmed it. But in 1945, this wasn't yet established fact for the general public. The Soviets were being deliberately vague, and rumors were swirling that Hitler might have escaped. So when these mysterious U-boats appeared in Argentina, it was natural for speculation to run wild. The person most responsible for connecting these U-boats to Antarctica was a Hungarian exile named Ladislas Szabo, who was living in Argentina at the time. Szabo was a journalist and writer who had fled Europe during the war. In 1947, he published a book titled Hitler is Alive, which laid out his theory. Szabo claimed that one or both of these U-boats had first traveled to Antarctica, where they had offloaded Hitler and other high-ranking Nazis at a secret base. According to his theory, Hitler and his inner circle were now living in a hidden Antarctic fortress, waiting for the right moment to return. It's important to understand, Szabo provided no concrete evidence for any of this. He had no photographs, no documents, no testimony from the submarine crews supporting an Antarctic voyage. The commanders of both U-530 and U-977 explicitly denied ever going to Antarctica. But Szabo's book was published at a time when people were hungry for sensational stories about Nazi mysteries and Hitler's fate. And here's where the conspiracy theory really took root. While Szabo's specific claims were unsupported, they contained just enough elements of truth to seem plausible. There had been a German Antarctic expedition. British intelligence was concerned about Antarctic bases. The U-boat surrenders were genuinely mysterious. By weaving these facts together with speculation and imagination, Szabo created a narrative that has persisted for nearly 80 years. But there's a massive problem with the idea of U-boats visiting Antarctica, a problem that anyone who understands submarine operations and Antarctic conditions would immediately recognize. Let's think about the timing. Both U-530 and U-977 would have had to travel to Antarctica in June, July, or early August of 1945, if they went there at all before arriving in Argentina in mid-July and mid-August. But June, July, and August are the depth of winter in the southern hemisphere, and winter in Antarctica isn't like winter anywhere else on Earth. This is the harshest, most inhospitable environment on the planet. First, there's the pack ice. During Antarctic winter, sea ice forms around the entire continent. This isn't thin ice you could break through easily. This is pack ice 1 to 2 meters thick. Scientific studies have shown that this ice extends outward from the Antarctic coast between 500 and 1,600 kilometers. That's 300 to 1,000 miles of solid ice barrier surrounding the continent. For a German U-boat to reach the Antarctic coast in winter, it would need to travel hundreds of kilometers, possibly over 1,000 kilometers, under solid ice. This presents immediate, insurmountable problems. German U-boats of World War II weren't true submarines in the modern sense. They were submersibles. There's an important technical distinction here. Modern nuclear submarines can remain submerged indefinitely. They generate their own power, produce their own oxygen, and can stay underwater for months. World War II. German U-boats couldn't do any of that. They were designed to operate primarily on the surface, using diesel engines for propulsion. When they needed to dive to avoid detection or attack, they could do so, but only for limited periods. Underwater, a U-boat had two options. It could run its diesel engines using a snorkel, a tube that extended to the surface to draw in fresh air and expel exhaust. But this only worked when the submarine was at periscope depth, with the snorkel above water. Under pack ice, a snorkel is useless. The alternative was to run on electric batteries which powered electric motors. But these batteries had very limited capacity. Depending on speed, a submerged U-boat could run on batteries for maybe 24 to 48 hours before they were depleted. Then the submarine absolutely had to surface to run the diesel engines and recharge the batteries. So even if a U-boat could somehow navigate under the pack ice, which would be extraordinarily difficult in darkness with limited navigation equipment, it would need to surface every day or two. And this is where the plan falls apart completely. Could a German U-boat surface through 1 to 2 meters of solid ice? In theory, possibly, if the ice was relatively thin and the submarine came up with enough force. Modern nuclear submarines can surface through ice. They do it regularly in the Arctic. But these are much larger, heavier, more powerful vessels specifically designed for this capability. A World War II German U-boat attempting to punch through thick pack ice would be taking an enormous risk. If it got stuck, the crew would die. If the ice damaged the pressure hull, the crew would die. If the batteries ran out before finding a thin spot in the ice, the crew would die. Would submarine commanders really take these risks? And there's another critical factor, the crew's survival. Human beings need fresh air. A submerged submarine quickly accumulates carbon dioxide exhaled by the crew. Even with CO2 scrubbers, the air quality degrades rapidly. The crew would need to surface regularly just to breathe, certainly every 2 days at minimum, and preferably more often. Then there's navigation. In June and July, Antarctica experiences 24-hour darkness. The sun doesn't rise at all. Combined with heavy cloud cover, which is constant in the Antarctic, celestial navigation would be impossible. Dead reckoning under ice, with no visual references and limited instruments, over distances of hundreds of kilometers? The chances of getting lost and running out of battery power before finding the coast would be astronomical. Now let's say, against all odds, a U-boat somehow made it through the pack ice and reached the Antarctic coast. What would the crew find? They'd find average temperatures of minus 26 degrees Celsius. That's about minus 15 Fahrenheit. With the constant Antarctic winds averaging 15 kilometers per hour, the wind chill would bring effective temperatures down to about minus 40 degrees Celsius or minus 40 Fahrenheit. Remember, the submarine crew would be dressed in standard naval clothing, not Antarctic expedition gear. They'd have maybe a few hours to unload supplies or personnel before hypothermia became life-threatening. And for what? To offload people or cargo at a coast where there was supposedly a secret base, except there was no base, no supplies waiting, no shelter, and no means of survival. The scenario simply doesn't work. It fails on technical grounds, navigational grounds, and basic survival grounds. Could a U-boat theoretically make a suicide run to Antarctica? Perhaps. But could it arrive there with crew alive and accomplish any useful mission? Almost certainly not. Yet despite these insurmountable practical problems, the legend of U-boats visiting Antarctica has persisted and grown. And it didn't stop with Szabo's initial book. Over the decades, the story has been elaborated, expanded, and embellished to the point where it barely resembles the original claims. Let's trace how a dubious story from 1947 evolved into the elaborate conspiracy theories we see today. Szabo's original claim was relatively simple. Hitler and some Nazi officials escaped to a secret Antarctic base via submarine. That's it. There were no UFOs, no underground cities, no advanced weapons. But over the years, other writers picked up the story and added their own details. Some of these additions came from deliberate fabrication, some from misunderstanding of real events, and some from connecting completely unrelated historical facts. For example, some versions of the story claim that Hitler's cremated remains were transported to Antarctica and interred in an ice cave, along with boxes of Nazi treasure. There's no source for this claim. It appears to be pure invention, but it's been repeated so often that some people assume it must have some basis in fact. Then there's the Operation Highjump story. This is particularly interesting because it involves taking a real historical event and completely misrepresenting it. Operation Highjump was a real U.S. Navy operation that took place from August 1946 to February 1947. It was large, the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted at that time, involving 4,700 men, 13 ships, and multiple aircraft. But the operation's actual purpose was completely mundane and well documented. The U.S. military wanted to train personnel and test equipment in Antarctic conditions, establish an American presence in Antarctica for geopolitical reasons, conduct scientific research, test cold weather vehicles and aircraft, establish a permanent American base called Little America. 4. This was all publicly announced at the time. There was no secret mission to battle Nazis. But conspiracy theorists have claimed that Operation Highjump was actually a military assault on the secret Nazi base, and that the Americans lost the battle, possibly because the Nazis had advanced weapons or even extraterrestrial assistance. What's the evidence for this claim? Well, Operation Highjump did experience casualties. One aircraft crashed, killing 3 crew members. Another sailor died in an accident during the operation. These tragic but unremarkable accidents have been reinterpreted as battle casualties. The operation also ended earlier than originally planned, by about 6 weeks. The official explanation was weather and ice conditions. But conspiracy theorists claim this early departure was actually a retreat after military defeat. There's not a shred of actual evidence for any military engagement. No battle reports, no photographs, no testimony from any of the 4,700 men involved. No Japanese or neutral observers reporting combat. Just the normal accidents you'd expect from a massive operation in the world's most dangerous environment. Then there's the British commando raid story. Some versions of the conspiracy theory claim that an elite SAS unit conducted surveillance on the German Antarctic base during the war, and that British commandos launched an assault on it around Christmas 1945. This story has a fatal flaw. The SAS was disbanded in October 1945 and wasn't reformed until 1948. There was no SAS unit available to conduct raids in December 1945. But again, there's a kernel of truth here being distorted. Operation Tabarin, the real British operation in Antarctica, did involve military personnel, and it was conducted in secrecy. By taking this real operation and adding fictional elements, the conspiracy theory gains false credibility. Perhaps the strangest addition to the legend involves nuclear weapons. Some versions claim that the Nazi base was finally destroyed in 1958 when the United States detonated 3 atomic bombs above it. Now, the United States did detonate 3 nuclear weapons in 1958. That part is true. These were the Operation Argus tests, 3 high-altitude nuclear explosions conducted southwest of Cape Town, South Africa. But these weren't attacks on a secret base. They were high-altitude tests designed to study the effects of nuclear explosions on the Earth's magnetic field and radio communications. The tests were conducted at altitudes between 161 and 540 kilometers. That's 100 to 335 miles up in space. The closest detonation to Queen Maud Land, where the alleged Nazi base would be, was over 2,280 kilometers away and exploded at an altitude of 290 kilometers. If you're trying to destroy a secret base on the ground, detonating a bomb 180 miles up in space and 1,400 miles away is not the most effective strategy. But again, by connecting real nuclear tests to the Antarctica conspiracy theory, the legend gains false credibility. Someone researching this story might discover that yes, the U.S. did detonate nuclear weapons in the region in 1958, and if they don't dig deeper, they might conclude the conspiracy theory is true. This is how modern conspiracy theories work. They take real events, the German expedition, suspicious U-boat surrenders, Operation Highjump, Operation Tabarin, the Argus nuclear tests, and weave them together with speculation, fiction, and deliberate fabrication. The result is a story that sounds plausible because it contains so many true elements, but the overall narrative is completely false. The Internet has amplified this process exponentially. A researcher in the 1960s looking into this topic would need to visit libraries, find books and newspaper archives, and carefully trace sources. Today, a Google search returns thousands of websites and videos repeating various versions of the story. Many of these sites present their claims with confident authority, complete with dramatic music and ominous narration. The sheer volume of material creates an illusion of credibility. But volume isn't evidence, and dramatic presentation isn't proof. So let's address the elephant in the room. If a secret Nazi base was established in Queen Maud Land, where is it? This region has been extensively explored since World War II. Over 1,000 scientists from multiple nations have worked in this area over the past 8 decades. There are currently multiple research stations in the region: Russian, Indian, German, Norwegian, and others. Satellite imagery covers every square kilometer of the continent. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped subsurface features. And in all this time, with all this scientific activity, with all this technology, not one piece of corroborated physical evidence for a secret Nazi base has ever been found. No structures, no artifacts, no documents, no debris fields, nothing. The Schirmacher Oasis, the warm, ice-free region discovered by the German expedition, has been continuously occupied by researchers since the 1960s. If there was a Nazi base there, scientists living there year-round would have found it by now. Some conspiracy theorists argue that the base was underground, carved into the ice, and that the entrance has been deliberately concealed. But ice moves. Antarctic ice isn't static. It flows like a very slow river. Any structure built into the ice in 1940 would have been deformed, crushed, or carried away by glacial movement decades ago. And any entrance would have been covered and buried beyond recognition. Others argue that evidence has been suppressed by governments who know the truth but keep it secret. But this requires us to believe that multiple countries, the United States, Britain, Russia, Norway, Germany, India, and others, have all maintained perfect secrecy for 80 years. Countries that were enemies during the Cold War, countries with different political systems, countries whose scientists publish thousands of peer-reviewed research papers about their Antarctic work, they're all somehow in on the conspiracy? The truth is simpler and less exciting. The Germans conducted a real expedition in 1938-39. They mapped territory, conducted research, and went home. They planned to return, but the war intervened. After the war, some mysterious U-boat activity occurred, probably involving evacuation of personnel or assets to South America. And a Hungarian writer in Argentina, capitalizing on post-war confusion and sensational stories, invented a connection to Antarctica that never existed. Over the decades, this initial fabrication has been elaborated with additional fictional elements while being anchored to real historical events to create false credibility. The result is a modern myth, a story that persists not because of evidence, but because it's dramatic, mysterious, and touches on our fascination with unsolved historical mysteries. The Nazi Antarctic Base conspiracy theory is a perfect example of how historical myths are created and perpetuated in the modern age. Start with real events, add speculation and fiction, present the mixture as suppressed truth, and let the internet do the rest. It's a compelling story. I'll admit, a secret Nazi base in Antarctica makes for great entertainment. It's been used in movies, video games, novels, and countless TV documentaries. As fiction, it's perfectly fine. The problem comes when fiction is presented as fact, when entertainment is sold as suppressed truth, and when people believe dramatic narratives without demanding evidence. The real story of Nazi activity in Antarctica is less exciting, but more interesting in its own way. It's a story about economic competition for resources, about scientific exploration in the age of ideology, about the fog of war and post-war confusion, and about how legends are born from ambiguous events and incomplete information. Did the Nazis visit Antarctica? Yes. Did they conduct significant scientific research there? Yes. Did they plan to establish a whaling base? Yes. Did World War II interrupt those plans? Yes. Is there any credible evidence for a secret military base, underground facilities, or post-war Nazi presence? No. Sometimes the truth is less dramatic than the fiction. But understanding how these myths are constructed, how real facts are interwoven with speculation and falsehood, that's valuable. It teaches us to think critically about sensational claims, to demand evidence, and to trace sources. Because at the end of the day, the real conspiracy isn't a secret base in Antarctica. The real conspiracy is how easily we can be convinced to believe compelling stories without demanding proof. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting and informative, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Let me know in the comments, were you familiar with this conspiracy theory before watching? And what other historical mysteries would you like me to investigate? Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and always remember, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.